Space Talks with Z is hosted by America's Future Series great friend and advisor, Zahir Ali. Space Talks with Z provides a forum for thought leaders to share insights and recommendations on how America and its allies can stay at the forefront of exploration, commercialization, and defense of space. Please visit our website to register to see all of Z's content and our many other programs for free at www.americas-fs.org.
Hi there, folks, and welcome back to Space Talks with Z. To kick off our 2023 series, we've got some special guests talking about things that are very much topics du jour. Bailey and Bryce from Aegis Space Law, and we're going to be jumping into and unpacking some recent events around sanctions against companies that are using data and providing it to interesting people around the world. Before we jump in, just want to thank our sponsor here, Zero North, run by Ken Lusinger. Also, want to remind folks that we have coming up the Dual Use Tech Summit for America's Future Series that's sponsored by Deloitte and Comtech. So thanks to them for helping us bring this. That National Security Dual Use Tech Summit is on March 10th. And more information is available below or on the America's Future Series website. So with all that said, let's jump right in. Bailey, Bryce, can I toss it to you guys to introduce yourselves and Aegis? Bailey?
Oh, so I'm Bailey Reichout. I'm one of the co-founders of Aegis. I'm also an international trade and regulatory attorney with a focus on this commercial space. So I'm here today excited to talk to you a little bit about sanctions. We're going to try to break it down into some actually useful information that you can do to avoid some of these most recent news events happening to your company. Bryce?
Hi, I'm Bryce Kennedy. I'm an attorney with Aegis and also the Director of Business Development. So we're building out some really cool programs and a certification process with one of our other entities that we're excited to jump in and talk about at some point.
Great. So, this is a very interesting time. It seems that sanctions are really in the headlines, it seems almost every day in one way or another. You've had activity around the Middle East with Iran. You've, of course, got the war in Ukraine and everything surrounding that. And then, zoom across the continent and get to the Pacific, and you've got challenges going on in Southeast Asia, of course, around China. And these political economic trends keep swirling and just making this environment very complicated. So, what we've seen here, for example, is a recent article by Space News talking about a Chinese satellite firm that supplied imagery to something called the Wagner Group, which is not exactly a state entity, but supports the Russian state. And that data became actionable in Ukraine. So you've got this really mixed up thing happening where you got a private company selling something to a private company that is effectively a defense contractor that affects a conflict in which the US is not directly involved, but we sanctioned somebody for aiding the not enemy in that conflict. So there are all these conditional there. It's really, to me, this is a big onion. So maybe we can jump in and see if we can think about what that means and how that works.
Yeah, and it's a relatively complex topic to break down, so I don't know if we'll be able to get into the weeds of all of it just in this conversation. But this is absolutely why I tell people like export controls and sanctions being included in US export controls is kind of pivotal to being in the space sector. Anytime you start dealing with actors abroad, or you're dealing with these types of technologies like satellite or like SAR imaging, you have to think about export controls, and you have to think about the chain of custody, who you're interacting with in that foreign country, and then who they might be interacting with. And it is on you as a US person or a US company to do your due diligence. You can't stick your head in the sand, and the regs essentially say that you must do due diligence. Part of that due diligence is to see if parties are on sanctions list. We have quite a few different sanctions lists, and this is talking about sanctions by OFAC, which is part of the Treasury Department. There's also lists that are kept by the Department of Commerce and the Department of State. And there's a lot of lists. So I'm not going to go through all of the lists. You do not have to go through and check list by list, thank God. There's actually a tool called the Consolidated Screening List. I'll show it in a screen share in just a second, but it's one of the things you can do as a company to make sure you're not accidentally doing business with Russia or China. One of the things that many people may have heard of, if you haven't, now you're hearing about it, so you know you're not sticking your head in the sand, right? Is military end-use list, military end-use restrictions. This is essentially a list kept by Bureau of Industry and Security, and you can find it under the EAR, the Export Administration Regulations, saying, hey, here are a list of actors we think are highly likely to divert things of important national security interest or significance, controlled items to, say, Russia and China or other countries we don't want them to divert to. You have to get a license if you're dealing with one of these parties. You're probably surprised. I said you have to ask for a license, not that you can't do it. You have to ask for a license. Now, are you going to get that license? Well, only the government can tell you that, but the presumption is no, you probably won't. So if you're making your business all about doing business with China or another party whom you know is directly reselling to China, you might want to rethink that as a US company. Where it gets tricky is, where does this end? If I have a big international company and say I have an entity in like Italy and they have an affiliate company. Affiliate means they're not a parent, it's not subsidiaries, right? So it has to do with control and ownership, of which they would have no control or majority ownership to be an affiliate. So if I have an affiliate in Italy and there's no US persons involved and it's not a US company and they want to do business with a sanctioned party, a US sanctioned party like China, can they? Yes. Yeah, we're not controlling them. Where it gets tricky though is, are they dealing in US goods with that Chinese party? For instance, would they be, and many people are familiar with export controls know that if you incorporate one ITAR controlled item in an end use or an end item that's otherwise EAR controlled, you may convert the whole thing. You've tainted that whole item with ITAR, and now the ITAR follows you. So that's a little caveat there. But if it's free of US content, US technology, and US persons, you know, and you're not a US company, then these sanctions aren't going to stop you. It's when you become a subsidiary to a US company, they apply to you. When you employ US persons, these can apply to you. You have all of this to consider when you deal with anything coming out of the US. And that's where the water gets really murky, because you have to follow that chain to understand who's doing what where and what your due diligence obligations are.
It's very interesting. Now, one
follow-up
of the things
question?
well, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. What's also striking about the recent events around this sanction by the U.S. against this data company is that it's data, right? This is not exactly IP in the way we typically think about it, right? It's not, it's not tech data. You know, the designs for the right geometry for stealth or for an electronic, and it's not hardware that can be directly used in some way. This is pure data. So thinking about this, I think there's a lot of companies that think, well, okay, services are, how do services fit into this? How does data fit into this structure? Because it's not the thing that we have typically thought of when we think of what's EAR controlled or what's ITAR controlled, etc. So curious as to how one might think about that.
Well, when you get into the ITAR, services are absolutely controlled. That is an activity that's controlled. Services are not expressly controlled under the EAR. However, this just gets back to it gets a little bit outside of export controls, and it gets into these different lists of actors you're allowed to do business with or support in doing business. For instance, one of the general prohibitions under the EAR says that a US person cannot, and let me actually use the right words here, a US person cannot support or help transact business with like restricted military end users or anyone else the government has said is on one of these barred party lists. So it goes a little bit further when you get over into these lists and the due diligence and the sanctions. It's not necessarily, do you need a license to transact goods or data? It's, can you even interact with a sanctioned party? Can you support them? Can you provide any assistance when you know that the end use is military related? So sanctions tend to go a little bit further.
I see. So it's a tighter discussion there. And so, what, you know, it might be interesting to take a look at that consolidated list to understand how this looks like to somebody trying to do their own, a little bit of their own due diligence.
Yeah. And the first step to doing due diligence is just the obvious. I mean, you don't need lawyers for this, right? It's whenever you receive a request for a quote or an inquiry from a party you don't have some sort of relationship with, the first thing you want to do a Google search, you know, see if they're embroiled in any crazy litigation, what's their reputation, see if you can find basic information about them on the internet, who owns them, who's funding them. Like you said, in this particular instance with the Space News article and the Chinese group and Wagner, who owns Wagner? Well, Wagner, I believe they're a parastatal. Parastatal often means there's ownership or control by the government. And then you also have just defense contractors. So you should look for these things in free sources if possible. Let me screen share real quick. I'm just going to show you the consolidated screening tool. Here's the consolidated screening list. Can you see it?
Yep. So that's pretty clear. You know, it's got a search function. That's nice.
Yes, it has a search function that aggregates all of these lists I've been telling you about. And all these different agencies have all their different lists they control, and you get on them for different reasons. Different things happen when you're on these lists, even sanctions. We have what's called complete embargoes, right? Which is when you absolutely can do no business with them. So think Cuba. But also we have more targeted sanctions, which might be against a specific entity. And that's what happens a lot with, let's see, I'm trying to think of a good example. There's a whole list of targeted sanctions, and it includes different companies and different people in different countries, but not like the entire country generally. Instead of going through all of those different lists, you can go to the consolidated screening list. Note, it's a normal search function. I actually already typed in a search here for Wagner. And if you type in Wagner on this function, here it comes, specially designated nationals by the Treasury Department. That's the list it's on. If you want to go read what happens when you get on that list, you click on the links. You should click on the links because it may not be a barrier to business. In this case, it is, but in some situations, it may just say you can't send this particular item to this country, or you have to get permission, of which it's not always a presumption of denial. There just may be certain restrictions or reporting requirements.
So this is super clean and easy. You can get started. Now, one thing, and maybe I could toss this at Bryce, because I know he's been at a launch recently and been a little integrated with some space companies here alongside, of course, the work that you do, Ellie. But you know, it's interesting because suddenly, right, for doing business with Wagner, we have sanctioned a company from China, which perhaps ostensibly people were already doing business with. There may be a company or multiples in the U.S. for components or what have you that have open orders with them. How's that going to be dealt with, and how are the ripples for this going to get felt throughout the space ecosystem?
Good question.
Go ahead, Bryce.
I could just briefly talk about this. We're actually having a podcast with Greg on February 9th, where we're going to, Greg Autry, dive into that more and more of, because one of the questions that Bailey and I were asking ourselves actually this morning on a call was, we see all these, everyone wants to change the policy, everyone wants, things to be streamlined, and we get it because we're, Aegis especially is trying to push to make sure commerce is moving forward quickly and rapidly with as many safety, regulations in check, where we can make sure we're not like China, where we're just kind of doing things on the fly and stealing information to do this. So the balance, especially where we're at and our location, is a really interesting nexus. I wanna highlight real quick. I don't know if I can share my screen. There we go. So can you guys see this?
Yep.
Alpha Bravo.
You see AB, the future of orbital transfer.
Okay, cool. So this is the kind of our answer to this right now. Basically, one of the phrases we're kind of using, or our mantra right now, is right now, right? We can wait till the regs are changed. We can wait till everyone has their input and all this other stuff. But to your question, I think one of the best things that we can do is start educating people, just like Bailey did with that. We're showing where you get the consolidated list, where you can start seeing what works, what doesn't, not having to pay, a huge law firm $1,500 an hour, because that's going to just stifle more and more commerce. So the reason I'm bringing up this website is it's a completely fictitious website. And we created this website to go in conjunction with our boot camp, which is another tier of this educational level. What we're doing is trying to basically help instruct and open and democratize all the information that's out there for space in terms of regulations, so people can access it themselves. They know where to find it, they know the timelines, they know how much it is, and they know the people who to talk to. And so one of the tools that we're using here is this Alpha Bravo space company. And basically it is riddled with errors and problems that a lot of space companies do unknowingly. And one of the big things in space, especially with law and engineering and everything, is the unknown unknowns. And so if you can see here for the first one, invest in the future, right? So right there is already a violation. Or if you look at investors, kind of to what Bailey was talking about, or excuse me, the team. The team itself, if you go into their bios, all kinds of errors. And then we have a Russian oligarch at the end that is investing.
You should do diligence on all parties you work with, not just those you're selling things to, but those you take money from for investment as well. Everyone. You should run everyone through the consolidated screening list and at least do a Google search to meet your due diligence requirements to make sure you don't end up in some of these issues. And same when you're working with sister parent companies internationally, make sure they're educated on what US laws are as well, because they may inadvertently be committing some sort of violation because they just didn't know, oh, hey, we were actually called out because we have a bunch of US engineers over here in our Italian office, or because we have, we're a subsidiary of a US company. So it's just really important to consider this stuff, and with every party you do business with. Would you mind restating your last question again, Zahir? I want to make sure we bring it full circle.
Yeah, really, also, the thing I think that's left to discuss from my question, so that's really clear and helpful to think about. The space industry needs to educate itself so that it doesn't fall into these traps. So that's one part of the ripple up. I just wonder what also happens and what the process is once a company gets sanctioned, for example, and say you were doing business with them. What do you do? This sounds like you just ghost them?
So it's not quite that simple, and nothing is, right? It depends on why they're sanctioned and how they're sanctioned. For instance, some lists, the unverified party list, for instance, that's simply one that you're unverified. The government cannot verify the information you've given them. So you can appeal to be taken off that list. There's a process for that. It's in the regs. Not every list has that process. And of course, not every sanction is a complete embargo saying no one can do business with you whatsoever. you have to really look at the different lists or the reason why you're being told you can't do business. It may be you ask permission to do business or participate in that particular activity, and you might get permission. It really just depends on what the issue is. Are you going to get permission to do business with Russia? No, probably not. I can't imagine how that would happen right now. So some requests would be much more realistic than others, but it really just depends on what you're doing and the specific variables.
Very interesting. Now, Bryce, you mentioned a boot camp. This sounds like a really great opportunity. Can you just share what that's about and maybe the info, when, where, etc.?
I will segue in that we will be talking about export controls and running due diligence. We'll be talking about due diligence on many levels, talking about like securities and investor due diligence, as well as export due diligence, sanctions due diligence, those types of things. We're going to have a module on the ITAR and the EAR. It will touch on OFAC sanctions. But more than that, it's going to comprehensively explain many different facets of regulatory requirements that space companies have to deal with right now to successfully get their launch or get on orbit to achieve mission 1. So we're hoping that, fully intend to run this again, but we're hoping that what we get as feedback from this first run of Space Regulatory Bootcamp is that companies came and they saw all these crossroads where regulations were going to intersect that they weren't anticipating. They left being able to anticipate it, and they were able to save a great deal of their operating budget from going to lawyers and redirect it to technical innovation. That is the goal here. So I'll let Bryce take over and explain to you the logistics.
That's good. Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing that we always hear is, I was just talking to a company a while ago, and their contracting officer on the government side actually messed up one of the contracts because they didn't have the knowledge that they should have, and the company relied on that, this launch company. And because of that, the ripple effect was massive because the government didn't really care that their person screwed up. And so it pushed back funding, launch dates, lost an incredible amount of hours on the team to research and understand where it went wrong. And again, it's just to us, it's all about education and bringing in that information in one place where you can start again knowing where to look, who to ask, what the timeframes are, what you know that or what you don't know that you don't know, and pull it all together.
Bryce, one of the examples we talked about this morning, I think might be relevant here, so that everyone doesn't think this is all about export controls. We're actually talking about the FCC Part 25, which is space comms. If you want to do a full satellite constellation, you're looking at Part 25 with the FCC. So one of the things we started noticing when working with startups in Part 25 is that there is a surety bond requirement. And the surety bond requirement, it looks small when you're just reading through the regs. But then when you look at if a startup has the ability to actually borrow money for the amount of that surety bond, which can be in the millions, they don't have the history or the credit score for their entity to be able to qualify for that.
Right.
So that surety bond, which was one line in the regs and very easily met by Lockheed Martin or OneWeb, they don't have those issues because they have established entities with history, financial history. For startups, this becomes another massive hurdle. And it's just something that our regs aren't built to anticipate. But if I tell you right now, if you have a startup business and you want to do a full satellite constellation, it's going to cost you at least $250,000 to go full Part 25. It's an ongoing fee. You're going to pay the application fee, then you're going to pay annual fees on top of that. They're going to be big. And there are a lot of requirements that come with getting an FCC license. It's not just a one-off deal. You don't just walk away with it and not talk to anyone for many years and do your mission. That's not how this works. You're also going to have a surety bond requirement. You're going to have these obligations you have to meet, and they are not small expenses, and they are ongoing and recurring. They come with international obligations, such as the International Telecommunications Union, which also has a fee, by the way.
Which we also have a speaker on.
Amazing.
If you know that ahead of time, I think that's going to change how you fundraise just a little bit.
Yes.
A lot of investors are expecting that once, as they're becoming more educated and intelligent in the space community, they're starting to ask those questions. right at the beginning, especially with spectrum management and authorization. A lot of companies just assume that that's just something they can jump into, and if they're not a year or two out and haven't even started thinking about it, then a lot of companies,
So if they haven't roadmapped that, if they haven't roadmapped that, they almost are, they are setting themselves up for failure, because the processing times are going to be what they are. There's no way to accelerate that with resources or anything. That's out of their control. So if they're dependent on it, it has to be done in the right time, and they have to be thinking about it. So that's really interesting, because then this workshop is not really just for lawyers, right? It's really for anybody who needs to lead or be part of the decision-making process for companies in this sector. They need to be there and have the ability and the education to think holistically about this.
Yeah, I'm thinking, just talking to engineers, right? So mostly we talk to lawyers, but hey, engineers, you know how much money it costs when you have to re-engineer your entire solution, 6 months in? That's a huge chunk of money. You don't want to spend that money on re-engineering solutions. If you choose the wrong antenna and you're not able to get permission to operate in the frequency in which your uplink and downlink for that antenna are operating, you're going to have to re-engineer your entire spacecraft design. And if you already have signed launch agreements, you could have penalties there. And this could all, again, be major setbacks, destroy your operating budget, and put you back at square one. These are things you have to think about in the beginning. You're going to save a ton of money, and you're going to have breach of contract issues, and not going to lose nearly as much sleep at night. You know what's ahead of you, and you're able to account for that, even in things such as your engineering.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we've covered a lot of ground here already, and clearly, folks, I will put the workshop information below so that you can attend this one or future ones, and follow Aegis Space Law and keep up to date with their activities. I just kind of want to throw it back at you both. One last maybe closing comment on what we might see moving forward. Little crystal ball type, but it seems like the Ukraine war is accelerating our realization of a lot of things in this sector, both the applications on the defense and the non-defense side, as well as the vector in which we're going to have to interact with friends and less than friends in this sector. What do you see coming down the pipe that you might want to highlight?
I always think about change. What's going to change? What's going to create the change for us to be able to work with people, to have the rigs that can match the speed at which we want to accelerate the space industry. And unfortunately, I keep coming back to, especially the way the US works, is the Sputnik moment. And I hope it's not a Sputnik moment, but I really, every time you look at history, and history always, really spells out kind of the roadmap of the way of the thinking of a nation. I have a feeling for Congress to really start implementing the change that we need at the rate and the speed we do, to start matching these countries and the velocity at which we want to go. It might take a Sputnik moment, and I don't want to be that like this be a prophecy where it's like it'll rain down terror and everything's gonna happen. But for me, I think it will have to take some event like that. Obviously, the Ukraine hasn't really moved too quickly. I mean, there have been, Bailey knows better on export control regs, some movement on that, but overall, to see an overhaul of the whole system, I think it's going to take something pretty major to get people to actually pay attention in the government.
Okay. In the meantime, we have to work through the system we have.
Exactly.
Bailey,
exactly.
Over to you. What do you think is interesting coming down the pipe here?
I am going to take this a little bit of a different route. Sorry, I have a little bit of a lag on my side. I'm sorry if I'm talking over someone.
Nope. Go ahead.
Yeah. So my answer to that is that I hope that we just see continued spurred innovation. Unfortunately, conflict is one of the things that does spur the most innovation. I want to see that innovation succeed, and I want to see it used for implementing new and better resources on Earth, as well as in our space missions. What we're doing regarding this is we're addressing how companies deal with the regs now, and then taking those shortcomings and the problems and the hurdles and the walls they're running into, and hopefully using that to drive change in policy. One of the most optimistic things I think I've seen recently was the Biden administration saying that they're going to issue an executive order here at the end of Q1 2023, streamlining the different agencies you have to talk to in order to complete a commercial space mission. I don't know what that looks like. I certainly think it's a step in the right direction. We need to make the regulatory compliance easier in order to help our companies innovate faster and to help them keep directing their funding towards that technical innovation and not towards the regulatory slog they have to deal with. We want the startups to compete. We want them.
So, hey, looks like we lost you there for a second. Welcome back, Bailey. So maybe you could just finalize your thoughts there for us regarding the policy.
Based on my continual losing my connection, I could really use one of those Starlink satellites to come over North Carolina. That would be great. So I definitely want to see technology continue to innovate. I want to see it expand throughout the US or throughout the world. And we definitely have to have regulatory reform to stay up to speed with the rest of the world. So we're going to be, as part of our mission, teaching people how to comply with laws and regs now, how to prevent spending all of their money on that, and the fallout if they don't anticipate them, and then using a lot of the data and information we gather to try to push for policy change and reform that actually drives technological innovation and keeps us competitive on an international stage.
Awesome. Thank you, Bailey. Well, Bailey, Bryce, this has been a really amazing conversation. Thank you so much. Really insightful. Folks, please, if you're interested, check out Aegis Space Law and sign up possibly. I think there might be a few seats left for the boot camp 21 through 23 February. It's coming up here just in little less than 3 weeks. And that would be a great place to go learn about really how to do the right thing in the right way. And moving forward, please continue to watch this space at America's Feature Series, Space Talks with Z. We are going to have continuing on topic and timely discussions regarding space policy and leadership. Take care, folks. Thanks again, Bryce, Bailey.
Thank you, Z.